Blizzard shut down a game that millions of people love, replaced it with a sequel that was supposed to be better in every way, and then spent the next 4 years systematically proving that they had fundamentally misunderstood why people loved the original in the first place. That is not an opinion. That is the documented history of Overwatch 2. Overwatch launched in 2016, and it was genuinely special. A hero shooter with colorful characters, tight team-based mechanics, and an accessibility that brought people into the genre who had never touched a competitive shooter before. It sold tens of millions of copies, built one of the most recognizable rosters in gaming, and created a professional esports league that Blizzard invested enormous resources into building. Then, in October 2022, Overwatch 1 was taken offline permanently and replaced by Overwatch 2, a free-to-play live service game that promised a new era for the franchise. What followed is one of the most instructive case studies in modern gaming history about what happens when a company prioritizes monetization strategy over the trust of its existing community. And here in 2026, with enough distance to look at the full picture clearly, the honest assessment of Overwatch 2 is more complicated and more sad than simple anger allows for. The core gameplay of Overwatch 2 is genuinely good. That point needs to be stated clearly and without qualification, because the conversation around this game so frequently collapses into total condemnation that the actual mechanical quality gets buried. The hero shooter format, where each character and a roster of over 40 heroes brings a completely unique ability set, movement profile, and role to team composition, remains one of the most compelling competitive frameworks in multiplayer gaming. The shift from 6 versus 6 to 5 versus 5 at launch changed the dynamic of team fights significantly. Tanks became singular anchors rather than paired front lines. Support heroes gained more individual impact. Damage heroes found more space to operate. Whether that change improved the game or damaged it remains genuinely debated within the community, and both positions have legitimate grounding. The individual hero design in Overwatch 2 is where Blizzard consistently demonstrates their strongest craft. Heroes added since the sequel launched, including Kiriko, Lifeweaver, Alari, Venture, and others, each bring mechanics that feel distinct from everything already in the roster. Kiriko's Suzu ability, which cleanses negative effects and provides brief invulnerability, introduced a support mechanic that required entirely new defensive thinking from both teams. Mauga, the tank added later, plays as a dual minigun aggressive brawler that functions completely differently from any existing tank. The creative investment in hero design has remained evident even when everything surrounding that design became increasingly frustrating. The controls and responsiveness are as sharp as they have ever been. Overwatch was always a technically clean game in terms of input response and netcode performance, and Overwatch 2 maintained that standard. Hitbox accuracy, ability timing, and general moment-to-moment feel are all excellent. On PC, the game performs well across a wide range of hardware. Console versions with aim assist provide a competitive experience that is genuinely viable, rather than a compromised port. From a pure technical gameplay perspective, the game functions at a high level. The progression system is where the problems begin, and they are serious problems that shaped the entire narrative around this game for 4 years. At launch, Overwatch 2 locked newly released heroes behind a Battle Pass system. Players who did not purchase the premium Battle Pass or grind extensively through the free track could not immediately access new heroes in competitive play. For a game built around team composition and counterpicking, locking heroes behind a monetization system created a genuine competitive disadvantage for players unwilling to spend money. The community reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Blizzard eventually reversed this decision and made new heroes accessible to all players through gameplay, but the initial decision established a template of trust erosion that subsequent choices reinforced rather than repaired. The cosmetic monetization in Overwatch 2 replaced the loot box system of the original game with a direct purchase shop where individual skins were priced at levels that the community found consistently difficult to accept. Legendary skins priced at around $20 each for a free-to-play game created a perception that Blizzard viewed the player base primarily as a revenue source rather than a community to serve. The Battle Pass provided some value for players who engaged with it consistently, but the overall monetization architecture communicated priorities that sat uncomfortably alongside the game's free-to-play positioning. The promised PvE story missions were a significant part of the original marketing for Overwatch 2. The vision presented before launch included a substantial story mode with hero progression, talent trees, and narrative content that would justify the sequel label. What was eventually delivered was a small number of story missions with stripped-down progression compared to what was promised, followed by an announcement that the originally planned PvE mode had been cancelled. For players who had accepted the shutdown of Overwatch 1, partly on the basis of what Overwatch 2 was supposed to become, that cancellation was a defining moment of broken trust. The story missions that did release are competent and occasionally genuinely enjoyable, but they exist as a fragment of a promise rather than its fulfillment. The actual narrative lore of Overwatch has always been delivered primarily outside the game itself, through animated shorts, comics, and written stories, rather than in-game content. The characters in the Overwatch roster are well designed, with distinct personalities, backstories, and relationships that the animated content explored with real quality. Tracer, Genji, Ana, Reaper, Widowmaker, Reinhardt, and the rest of the cast are genuinely compelling as fictional characters. The universe Blizzard built around them has real creative value. The tragedy is that this strong narrative foundation was never properly integrated into the game itself in a way that gave players a reason to engage with the story as part of their regular play, rather than as supplementary content consumed elsewhere. The map design in Overwatch 2 expanded beyond the original push and control formats to include new modes. Flashpoint introduced large maps with multiple capture points. Push mode added a robot that both teams fought to escort in opposite directions. New escort and hybrid maps brought fresh environments into the rotation. The visual design of maps remains a consistent strength, with locations spanning the globe, and each rendered with a level of environmental detail and personality that rewards attention. Numbani, Ilios, Busan, Esperanza, and the newer additions all feel like real places with identity rather than generic competitive arenas. The visual art direction of Overwatch 2 has always been one of its most defensible qualities. The stylized, vibrant aesthetic has aged gracefully, and in 2026 still communicates clearly and reads well in the chaos of teamfights. Character silhouettes are distinct and readable at speed. Ability visual effects communicate their function without obscuring the action. The technical performance on current hardware is excellent, with high frame rates achievable across most gaming setups and minimal technical issues in standard play. The sound design and music are strong throughout. Each hero has audio design that reinforces their personality, from Lucio's musical skating sounds to Reinhardt's armored movement to the sharp crack of Widowmaker's fully charged shot. Ultimate ability voice lines have become genuinely iconic within gaming culture. The music varies appropriately between maps and modes without becoming intrusive during competitive play. The esports dimension of Overwatch 2 deserves honest acknowledgement. The Overwatch League, which Blizzard built with enormous financial investment and city-based team franchises, struggled significantly and was eventually restructured away from the city franchise model. Viewership declined consistently from its peak years. The competitive ecosystem around Overwatch 2 exists, but it never recaptured the cultural momentum the original game generated during its peak years. By 2026, the competitive scene operates at a level respectable enough to sustain community interest without approaching the mainstream visibility Blizzard originally projected. The replay value question for Overwatch 2 depends entirely on your relationship with competitive multiplayer. Players who find deep satisfaction in mastering individual heroes, climbing ranked ladders, coordinating with consistent teammates, and engaging with regular seasonal content updates will find effectively unlimited value here. Players seeking narrative completion, progression milestones with clear endpoints, or a game that respects their time and money equally will find the experience increasingly mismatched with their expectations. Both responses are legitimate, and neither reflects a failure of understanding on the player's part. Looking at Overwatch 2 completely in 2026, the final picture is of a game with genuinely excellent mechanical foundations and creative hero design that was undermined systematically by monetization decisions, broken promises around content, and a series of community trust failures that compounded over 4 years. The gameplay when you are actually in a match remains among the best the hero shooter genre offers. The infrastructure surrounding that gameplay reflects priorities that the player base found difficult to accept, and that criticism is entirely fair. Overwatch 2 earns a 3.2 out of 5. The mechanical quality of the game itself sits considerably higher than that number suggests. The score reflects the complete product as it exists and has existed, including everything surrounding the gameplay that shapes the actual experience of being an Overwatch 2 player across its lifetime. A game this good at its core, deserving a score this qualified, is genuinely disappointing to write. But that disappointment is itself the most accurate summary of what Overwatch 2 ultimately became. If this kind of honest, unfiltered review is what keeps you coming back, drop a like because it genuinely helps this channel. Subscribe so the next review lands directly in your feed. Share this with someone who is still deciding whether Overwatch 2 is worth their time in 2026. And tell me in the comments, are you still playing Overwatch 2? Did you quit? And if you quit, what was the exact moment that made you finally close it for the last time? Because everyone who left has a specific story, and I want to hear yours.